excellent testimony. I'll begin the question and answer segment. Our Defense Department issued an annual report on military and security developments in the People's Republic of China, and it discussed in detail the construction of this new naval base in the South China Sea. And our report states that the base is large enough to accommodate the mix of nuclear-powered attack and ballistic missile submarines and advanced surface combatants, including aircraft carriers. Submarine tunnel facilities at the base could also enable deployments from this facility with reduced risk of detection. So I asked the panelists, could the continued Chinese naval buildup in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific eventually limit our U.S. Navy ability to patrol these waters, which would, of course, adversely impact the security and economic well-being of the American people and our allies in the Asian Pacific region? And secondly, about the U.S. allies' naval confrontation with China, looking at what has just been happening recently, in April, Chinese maritime surveillance vessels began a tense 10-day standoff with a Philippine Coast Guard cutter in the South China Sea. Then in July, Chinese patrol boats had a similar confrontation with the Japanese Coast Guard in the East China Sea. And last December, the captain of a Chinese fishing boat illegally poaching in the Yellow Sea killed a South Korean Coast Guard officer. So if a naval confrontation between Chinese vessels and a U.S. treaty ally, such as the Philippines, Japan, or South Korea, ever results in an exchange of gunfire, what are the treaty obligations of the United States Navy to come to the assistance of these allies? We will begin with the professor.
Thank you for those questions. Let me focus my attention on your first question about the Chinese naval buildup in the South China Sea. I think it's very important to note as the premise that the South China Sea is sort of a strategic pivot. It is the body of water that connects the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. It is at the junction of these two very important oceans that supports trade between Europe, Middle East, and East Asia, as well as trans-Pacific trade. So having command or having the capacity to control events in the South China Sea would give China tremendous amounts of strategic influence and power. Here are a couple of things that motivate China to, in fact, continue this buildup. First of all, having a naval base in Sanya on Hainan Island gives China an additional naval option with their nuclear attack submarines. These nuclear attack submarines can be used, for example, to break out into the Western Pacific to deter U.S. naval operations and air operations and other military operations related to—
And I'm going to interrupt you there, Professor, just to give the others a chance, if I may. Thank you. Ms. Glazer.
Sorry, Madam Chairman. First, I would say briefly, the United States overall will face with China's growing military capabilities a less permissive environment. It will be more costly for the United States to exercise the kind of sea control we have in the future. And we will have to think through what is the best way to address that. The capabilities that China is addressing in Hainan is just among those capabilities. There are, of course, many more, development of ballistic and cruise missile, anti-satellite weapons, et cetera. Regarding your second question, I am not an attorney, and the interpretation of the law is important when we look at treaties. But administration officials, of course, have made clear that we do have treaty obligations to Japan in the case of the Senkakus. We remain neutral, of course, on the sovereignty over those islands, but we do recognize that the Japanese have administrative control over those islands. And so if the islands were attacked, the United States, my understanding is obligated under Article 5 of that treaty. It's a bit less certain, I think, in the case of the Philippines. There isn't the same language in the treaty that refers to administrative control.
Thank you, and I'll just interrupt you there a second. Go ahead, Ms.
Could I just finish
Yes.
the sentence? Sorry. I was just going to add that if the Philippines' naval forces were attacked, regardless of where they were, I do believe that we would have an obligation to come to their defense.
Thank you. Dr. Cronin, a minute, and then...
I'll just leave the military issues to the military experts, except to say that obviously the U.S.-China military balance, if you will, is a distinct issue, but it's also connected to the politics of the region and our relationships with not only with China, but with our allies and partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks.
We face a tyranny of distance in the Pacific. And if we don't have the correct number of platforms...
Tyranny of distance.
And tyranny of distance, that's right. And people talk about that because it is such a big theater. If we don't have the number of platforms needed to project that power, if we don't have the basing for refurbishment and replenishment, we can't be a player. On the treaty, I would suggest that you ask the Congressional Research Service to tell you that. I've always operated under the belief that all of our treaty obligations, including those in NATO, require us to go through our constitutional processes of each country before any action would be taken, military or otherwise.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to yield to Mr. Berman for his question and answer.